everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to our next webinar, or the current webinar, the March webinar for the BCS branch in Cheltenham and Gloucester. And today we have Colin Palmer that's going to talk about green energy. Colin is from Wind Cluster, and he will introduce himself and talk about a lot of very interesting stuff. We're really looking forward to this webinar on green energy. Colin, thank you very much, and the mic is all yours.
Right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, sorry, my picture just appeared on the screen. It's a bit disconcerting. Can I just hide it? I don't like talking to myself if I can avoid it. That's better. Yeah, I'm Colin Palmer. I've been in renewable energy since the mid-80s, I guess, early 80s even. I started off working on wave energy in the British wave energy program. And when that got cancelled, I got involved in wind energy, and in a roundabout way set up my own wind energy company, Wind Cluster Limited, in 1988. Wind Cluster still exists. I'm still the managing director, and we own 4 wind turbines up in Cumbria. But along the way, I also got involved with a much bigger company, Wind Prospect. We had 250 or so people spread around the world and did mainly wind development, but also latterly solar and things like that. So, you know, I've been there, done that, and I've got a pretty good idea of what the industry is about. And I feel really honoured, actually, because when I started, it was a fringe occupation. People sort of thought, well, you know, one day he'll go and get a proper job. I trained as a ship designer or something, you know, do something like that. I mean, ironically, of course, ship design or shipbuilding in Britain was in terminal decline. I mean, I wanted to design yachts, not ships, but shipbuilding was in terminal decline. And it's now being revitalized by offshore wind energy. Places like the Tyne, the Tees, and the Humber are being revitalized by the manufacture and servicing of offshore wind turbines. So it's sort of come full circle. And things have changed, and it's gone from, you know, being a niche occupation to a huge international industry. So tonight I want to talk to you about the rise and the future of green energy. And I find that right. Okay, there we go. That's it. I want to make to you the argument that the economic case is over. The economic argument for wind and solar and batteries, they are economic in the world. They don't need any subsidy. They stand on their own against their competitors, and indeed they frequently undercut other sources of energy. So really the big issues we face globally as we try to achieve net zero is how to scale up, how to increase the capacity that we've got in order to do that. And also, given my audience, I wanted to talk a bit about the role that digitalisation and therefore computers and things can play in that. This afternoon, this is the actual output of this in this country, to give you a feel for where we are. This was, I can't remember, 3 in the afternoon when I was just putting the final touches to this presentation. We were getting 12% of our electricity from the sun. On a not particularly windy day, we were getting 23% from wind, 1.5 hydro, 36 still, of course, from gas, very little from coal, 3.4, bit from biomass, 14% from nuclear, and that percentage stays pretty constant, and a little bit was coming in from France probably. So you can see that even on a fairly average day before the summer, the good sunshine, and when there wasn't a lot of wind, we were still getting 35% of our electricity from wind and solar. I said that the cost argument had been won. It seems that has even got through to government, this government. Kwasi Kwarteng, who is, I can't remember his title, but he's some sort of business secretary. This was a very recent tweet, 28th of February. He says, "Remember, renewables are cheaper than gas." This is his contribution to this debate about what we should do now our vulnerability to Russia has been so starkly revealed. He then, this was one of a whole lot of 9 tweets altogether, but he also said, but the long-term solution is obvious. Gas is more expensive than renewable energy, so we need to move away from gas. So not only for security of supply, but for good old-fashioned economic reasons. So I want to look a bit at how this has all happened. But let's look at some other perhaps more considered views of the cost of energy. This is again slightly busy slide. The quick overview is that the paler blue bars are for renewable energy, the dark blue bars are for conventional energy. Horizontal scale is cost of energy, don't worry too much about the units. And then vertically, you've got a whole lot of different sources of this is electricity in this case. And I've highlighted in yellow the sort of average values for renewables, for solar and wind. And you can see that it's less than all the conventional sources. There are some diamonds in the conventional sources which fall within that yellow area, but they are actually the marginal cost. In other words, just in effect, the fuel cost of running those plants, which obviously they can't go on doing forever. So if they've got to build a new plant, it's more expensive in all cases. And this is another graph showing how that trend has happened. On the left, you've got 2009. You see back then solar was very expensive. Again, don't worry too much about the units. But solar was a lot more expensive than nuclear, coal, gas or wind. And gas and wind were the same back then. If we fast forward to 2018, cost of nuclear has gone up quite considerably. The cost of coal gone up a little bit. Cost of gas has gone down, but not as fast as the cost of wind. And the cost of solar has dropped dramatically. This is an interesting graph for nuclear energy. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when in 1954, the Queen opened the Calder Hall nuclear power station, the UK's first civil nuclear power station. This was, the future. This was going to be a wonderful thing for this country. And she said that, amongst other things, electricity was going to be abundant and too cheap to meter. Well, sadly for that hasn't come about. It's gone the other way. This is another take on the same sort of thing. This is looking forwards. This is a report that came out the last day or two. This is not exactly a company you would associate with renewables, BP, and this is their energy outlook till 2022. And they're projecting the cost of wind and solar relative to 2019. So you see cost relative is vertical scale, horizontal scale is time. Wind is going to drop probably by about 30% by 2030-ish. Solar is going to drop even more. And the cost of solar they're projecting is going to drop by 50% really quite soon. So big reductions still to come in solar, not so much in wind. But in many places, like around our shores, wind is significantly cheaper than solar. So it'll be a while here till there is a crossover. Let's look at what's happened historically for solar. This is done for all sorts of technologies. You could do this for cars, computers, computer chips, things like that. What you do is you plot the cost per unit of performance. In this case, it's dollars per watt on the vertical scale, and horizontally the volume that's been manufactured. Notice that both are log scales, and it is very common for technologies that this is more or less a straight line, a declining straight line, and that line is called the learning curve, and the rate there is 25%, and that's defined as the the reduction in cost for each doubling of capacity. It's like Moore's law. In a sense, Moore's law is a version of it, rather steeper, but a version of this. Now, 25% for a manufactured product is pretty steep. So this is it's not this is going down fast by comparison with most things. So you can see back in the mid 70s, prices were around about 100 units. By 2010-ish, they had dropped to 1 unit. So there'd been a 100-fold reduction in that period. And since then, they've dropped further, and they're now around about 0.3. And all the signs are that's going to continue. This is a projection by DNV, who are knowledgeable consultants in this, and they're looking at PV relative to 2017 in this case. You can see that it's dropped by 20% today, and they're projecting that by 2030 it will have dropped a further 50%. And this will be achieved in part just by the volume. And they and others reckon that in the near future, the world will be installing something like 300 gigawatts of capacity per year. That may not necessarily mean too much to you, but to put it in perspective, that would have the same output as 20 Hinkley nuclear power stations. So in other words, the world is building at the moment, and will continue to do, solar equivalent to 20 Hinkley power stations. And it's doing it quickly. It doesn't have the delays and the cost overruns that nuclear has. Here's another presentation, another view of the same issue. This is the installation of solar over time, horizontal scale time, vertical scale, the worldwide capacity. And you'll see that between 92 and 2000, it doesn't even show on the axis hardly, a mere gigawatt was installed. Then things started to take off. And by, what's that, about 2017, the world was installing 100 gigawatts a year. As I say, we expect within 1 or 2 years that to be up to 300 gigawatts. And in fact, the total now in the world is that graph is stopping at 700, but by the end of this year we'll probably be up to nearly 1,000. So you see there's some pretty impressive exponential growth going on there. So what's happening? Is this that exceptional? Well, actually, when you look back in history, no, it's not. It's a classic example of the penetration of a technology. This is a graph showing the penetration in America of a whole lot of different technologies. Over on the left, we've got cars, telephone, electricity, fridges, things like that. As we move across, we've got microwaves, color TV, computers. And what you notice is, it's a bit difficult with all this detail, but broadly, these things are following an S-shaped curve. Initially, nothing much happens. They're expensive, they're unreliable, or whatever. And it's early adopters, fans of these things who buy them. Then gradually, as that happens, they come down the cost curve. They get the cost reduces, and also they become more reliable, more attractive, better than the alternative. In the case of cars, suddenly horse and carriage didn't seem so good as it had before. That then you get this point where there's a rapid rise and a more or less constant rate of change for perhaps 80% of the time the product is there. And then, of course, eventually you get to saturation. Everyone's got one, everyone's got a car, everyone's got a television, and you're just into replacement. And so the curve then levels off, and you get these S-shaped curves. And that's been repeated time and time again. What is interesting now is that the rate of which these things are happening is speeding up. This is a similar graph, but the axis has changed a little bit. Vertical scale is the penetration again, but the horizontal scale is the number of years since the product was invented. So if we look at the automobile, the car, see, it was nearly 20 years after it was invented that it began to take off. Aeroplane even longer. So the Wright brothers, when they flew, it was 30 years or so until airplanes became increasingly widespread, and telephone and so on. TV was rather quicker, but notice that the PC, mobile phone, internet are almost instantaneous. So things are speeding up dramatically in our modern world. We see that rate of change everywhere, but it's applying to S-curves along with other things. So where are we on that S-curve? Well, this again goes back to the BP report, and you'll see there, this is what they're saying, that we are actually just in the bottom knee of the S. This is wind and solar capacity, and those different curves are their scenarios, but they're different views of the future. No one can know, of course, but that's an expectation of where the future's going. So we're now just getting to that point of making that takeoff. And this is a sort of academic view of what's been happening. Initially, you have an emerging market, early adopters, subsidy in the case of a product like this. And then as the product becomes cost competitive and no longer needs subsidy, you get into the high growth stage, and then it starts to mature. In the case of this, it means that all the existing generation has been replaced, and we're just looking at growth, GDP growth, and linking to that. So where are we in the UK? Well, I showed you the actual spot information from this afternoon. Over the year, on average, we get about 25% of our electricity from the wind, increasing amount each year, but last year it was about 25%. Globally, wind plus solar is somewhat less. It's about 10% globally, less than 5% in 2015. But it's the rate of increase that is impressive. In America, which is very much market driven, or 90% of all new generation in the States is renewable. So this has somewhat put the kibosh on Trump's drive to get coal, because whilst he was making all the noises about coal, the industry was busy building wind turbines and solar power because they made more profit out of it. They were no longer interested in coal. It just was not economically attractive. Recently in South Australia, they ran on 100% renewables for, I think it was 20 days. And they run on a high percentage of renewables most of the time. The International Energy Agency, who are in a sort of semi-government type organization that monitor the energy in the world, who for many years been apparently very skeptical of the progress of renewables, but in their most recent report, and for those of us in the industry, this is jaw-dropping, they said for projects with low-cost financing that tap high-quality resources, solar PV is now the cheapest source of electricity in history. Maybe we are actually approaching the days when we get power that is too cheap to meter. Another view of where different countries are. Again, somewhat busy slide, apologies. Vertically, you've got a whole lot of different countries, and each one has a horizontal line with 3 spots on. The left-hand spot is where they were in terms of renewables in 2010. The far right spot is 2020. You see Germany is, of the chosen countries, Germany is leading. Britain's doing really well. We had very little in 2010, but we've increased that dramatically, the overall EU and so on. You go down, then you see Russia and Indonesia and Saudi Arabia have got a long way to go. Canada, China, people criticize China, perhaps rightly, for creating a lot of CO2 and things, but they've actually also invested very heavily in renewables. And in fact, that cost reduction in solar is largely due to China driving the market. So what this means is for industry is things are changing. This is RollsRoyce, company you've probably heard of. This is their sales, annual sales from 2012 to 2020. I mean, that dip is COVID related, I suspect, but prior to that, pretty steady. They're providing, gas turbines, other things. It's not apparently a huge growth market. Enter Vestas, who make wind turbines. They're one of they're, I think, still the largest wind turbine manufacturer in the world. Much smaller than Rolls-Royce back in 2012, 13, third of what's the size. Well, in 2020, they overtook them. And Vestas are continuing to grow. And I say they're the largest company, they've only, I think, got 13, 14% market share. So you see, although they individually, the largest company, there's a lot of others around out there. Okay, this all sounds wonderful, good news. But there are, of course, challenges, and that's really what I wanted to talk about tonight. The challenges are these. They are intermittency, the fact that sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. It certainly goes up and down. And how do you deal with that? How do you balance that variation in the generation with variation in demand? And linked to that, how do you create a stable electricity grid that can handle that? How much space do we need? Renewable energy is less energy intensive than other forms of energy. The footprint, the physical footprint of a nuclear power station or a gas-fired power station for its size is relatively small. You need a considerably greater area to extract the same amount of energy or convert the same amount of energy in renewables. And people rightly are also concerned, if we're going to be building all these things, where are the resources going to come from? Well, let's just get a feel for the annual variability. This is the output from the wind farm that I run. It's normalized, so you've got the vertical scale is the average, and the deviation either side of the average over a number of years. You can see it's leaping about quite a lot. The bands are the probabilities. The lighter pink area is down to a 90% chance that will be the 10-year level. And then the bottom of the pink area is a 90% chance that will be the 1-year level. And you can see on a couple of years, we actually just about hit the 90%, but equally we've gone well above. So on average, we have achieved pretty much the P50, the average output we expected when we planned the project, but it is up and down. So we have to have a way globally and nationally of dealing with that. And that's the annual variation. This is the monthly variation. You see that's rather bigger still. In the case of wind, in the Northern Hemisphere at least, it does tend to correspond to demand. So you see there's peaks there every 12 months. So in the winter, there's more wind, which is when there's more demand for electricity. So that fits quite well. In the UK, solar doesn't fit too well, because obviously in the summer we actually need less energy, and that's when the sun is belting out. But in hot countries where air conditioning is a big load, then again, it does fit quite well. So there's a lot to be done for matching the technology to the demand pattern. So the sort of solutions people are coming up with is blending technologies. If you have a mix of solar and wind, for example, the chance of the wind not blowing and the sun not shining at the same time is much, much less than one or the other being low. So if you blend them together, you get a nearer to level output. Geographical distribution. At the moment over the UK, the winds are much stronger in the west than the east. So if we had more wind farms in the west, we'd be having a a better balance of the output than we do at the moment. Another thing is long distance interconnection. We already have some interconnectors. There's one to France, there's one to Norway, and we could put more of those in. And indeed, people are talking about putting in large amounts of solar in, for example, the Sahara, and connecting that by a long distance cable. The technologies are there. I mean, that can be done. It's the issue of cost. And of course, if the cost of energy is very, very low, then it can pay for a high connection cost. And indeed, it's the interconnection that enables France to run on nuclear. You possibly know France gets about 80% of its electricity from nuclear. Nuclear is a highly inflexible energy source. It can't go up and down to follow demand. So how do the French manage it? Well, they're connected by lots of wires to the countries around them, and they buy and sell electricity across those interconnections. We can do something similar, and globally, the technology is there. We can do something similar. We can also store electricity. The rise of lithium-ion batteries. They provide short-term storage. You can use compressed air. You can use hydro. I mean, we've had hydro power stations. We had the De Norwig power station, and that was put in to deal with the inflexibility of nuclear power, and it's now helping us manage the variability and intermittency of renewables. And electric vehicles, they are batteries on wheels, self-evidently, and there's a technology called vehicle to grid, V2G, where you bring your car home in the evening, or you put it outside the office, and you plug it into a special interconnector. It's connected over the internet, and it can buy and sell electricity. So you allow it to maybe go down by 20%. If there's a demand for electricity, it also gets topped up. I have a tariff where my car gets topped up at 3 in the morning. I don't do that. Some clever app does it for me, but the car just gets topped up and it's ready to go at 7 in the morning. That's what I programmed it to do. And that will become more and more common as more and more EVs hit the roads. Storage, longer term, what's called power to X in the jargon, making hydrogen, making ammonia, those sorts of things. So there are a lot of options around. As I say, linked to this is the whole business of the stabilizing the grid and balancing supply and demand. At the moment, or historically rather, we've had a system based on a cost hierarchy, because for fossil fuels, the different service, if you like, from the power comes with different costs. So quick response generation is much more expensive than baseload slow response generation. So there's a bidding system goes out and a cost hierarchy, and so depending on what demand is going to be, different power stations and power sources are called on to generate. It slavishly matches demand. So if there's a television program and everyone's going to switch their kettle on, that's anticipated, and the power is all purchased in order to supply that demand. And as I said earlier, with nuclear, because it's not flexible, you need something like De Norwig to pump water uphill when the demand is not there for the nuclear power. We never actually in this country reached the level of nuclear where that was critical, but that's where things were planned to go in the 60s when De Norwig was built. As it is, it's very handy these days. We can also use storage for shifting peaks. So if there's a peak of output which doesn't correspond to a peak of demand, you dump it into batteries and then release it later on. Also, more and more people are getting into what's called demand side management, where because of interconnection over the internet, it's possible for companies to sign contracts to say that they will turn down their demand, turn off a few machines, and get paid to do it at certain times. You can buy smart fridges which do the same, and as that sort of things becomes more and more granular, that has a huge capacity, and small batteries in homes can do the same. And you end up with building out virtual power plants because they're all these distributed sources of the demand side management joined together. And there are lots of very code intensive companies doing all this sort of stuff. So you end up with your virtual power plants. With renewables, you can also overbuild. There's not much marginal cost to operation. So if you have stuff somewhat idle some of the time, it doesn't matter too much. So that's another option as costs come down. And as I said earlier, there's the power to X opportunity. And what we'll be developing, which is very much computing intensive, is a smart grid. EVs as energy stores, interconnected, real-time trading and balancing, all cloud, IoT based, networked homes, network water heating, grid services, local networks. All this stuff comes together to make a smart grid. And it's a huge transformation, not unlike the transformation of the telephone system. If you go back to the 70s, phones were essentially dumb, they were fixed, top down, analog, and they just took voice. That was it. That's all they did. Come the 1990s, the mobile phone revolution started. Phones were still pretty dumb, but they were mobile. There was more choice, more providers. They were digital, they moved to digital. They were expensive, so they were used by business, and they carried voice, but also messaging, the first breakout, if you like, from the conventional phone. And then I think it was 2008. I don't know when. I think that's when the first smartphone came on the market. Things changed dramatically. You started carrying around a computer in your pocket. It could do Facebook. It had a camera. It had SMS. It had email, music, organizer, navigator, sensor. You name it. It could do it. And oh, it was also a phone. So it had completely changed in that period. And now you end up with a system which is diverse, distributed, digital, and disruptive. And above all, smart. So it was done for phones, and it will happen for the electricity industry. There are bits of the analogy which don't fit, but broadly, exactly the same thing will happen. So that's how we're going to deal with the intermittency and the variability of the output from renewables. But how much space do we need to do it? Well, I think that the bulk of supply will come from two key technologies. One is offshore wind, and the other is large-scale solar in high sunny areas, deserts, where you've got lots of sun and, relatively speaking, not too many environmental or planning issues for installing them. And so you can imagine large areas of the Sahara and things like that with significant solar installations. There will also be a rise of distributed supply, what you might call ubiquitous solar. At the moment, solar tends to be restricted to either the solar fields you see or on people's homes. But it will start to appear more and more often on the roofs of factories, on the facades of buildings, things like that. It'll start to be everywhere around us. And the resource is pretty impressive. This is the solar resource. And you can see, I mean, the paler the color, the more sunshine. It's sort of, it fits where you'd expect pretty much. And of course, Britain doesn't do too well. But even so, solar is just about competitive here in the UK. But for example, in the west of the States, and obviously all over the Sahara, large areas of China, though not all of it. China has a dark area as well. Pretty much all of Australia, and so on. I mean, there's a huge solar resource. But it tends to be inevitably concentrated towards the equatorial regions of the world. And this is an interesting graph. It shows the actual surface area that we need to cover with solar panels in order to generate electricity we need. The easiest thing is for 2030, which is projections for when we need to be approaching net zero. Those black squares and rectangles, that's all the area we need to cover. Now, I mean, of course, people wouldn't put huge, great solar farms covering those squares necessarily, but imagine slicing those up to lots of little bits and sprinkling them around. You'd hardly see them, and that's all we need to do it. So in terms of, the availability plan really is not a problem. And here's some examples of ubiquitous solar: car parks, facades on buildings, windows, all those sorts of things will start moving towards solar. I did a little calculation for the UK. Now, I'm not for 1 minute proposing we should do this, but it gives you an idea. This is the area we would require to get 100% of our electricity from solar in the UK. And okay, yeah, I've taken out Norwich and a big, and probably Manchester or somewhere. It's not a practical proposition, but I was actually surprised at how small it was. It's only 2.5% of the total land area, or 4% of farmland. So again, if you slice that up into lots and lots of little bits, it doesn't look so daunting. If we move on to wind energy now, this is the wind energy resource. And if you recall, if you think back to the solar one, it's almost completely the opposite. There's lots of wind in the northern and southern latitudes, not much through the middle of the globe. So again, there's no single bullet, silver bullet for renewables. It depends where you are in the world. So in the Midwest of America, you would do wind, whereas when you get further over towards California, you do solar. I mean, they have localized good winds as well. I mean, these are very general pictures, but you can see the trend there. Australia, interestingly, is very well blessed with both. They have very good solar resource and also a good wind resource, as does Argentina and countries like that. So some countries have both. Coming back to the UK, let's look at what area we would need for wind energy. This is a 1 nuclear power station's equivalent of offshore wind. It's bigger footprint than the power station itself, but not a huge amount of the North Sea. And that's the area required for 100% of our electricity. Again, it wouldn't be done in blocks like that. It would be done in rather more locations, and also, as I said earlier, there would be over on the west as well. I mean, it's not trivial, but it's not smothering. And in fact, again, I'm not necessarily proposing that we would do this, but come on, there we go. If we took all the energy the country needs, not just electricity, but all the energy we need, projected for 2050, that's the area we would need to cover with wind. I mean, that is substantial, but it covers Dogger Bank and a few other places, but that's for all the energy we need as a country. So it looks doable. What about other technologies? Well, people talk about wave energy, maybe, but wave energy is where it's yellow and red. Well, Tierra del Fuego does really well, but not too many people there. We do okay up in the UK. We're at the receiving end of the Atlantic gales. So there's a few places, South Australia perhaps, but it's a very limited resource. And there's another thing about wave energy, and this is from the wave energy I worked on at first, is that it tends to be rather linear. You see the black line, that was where we proposed to put a whole array of wave energy devices. They would have had the output of 2 gigawatts. That same output can be secured from the area in blue from offshore wind. So actually, and the thing about wave energy is you can't put lots and lots of rows because the machines take the energy out of the wave and it takes a long time for it to recover, whereas wind energy recovers relatively quickly. So they gain that there's not a huge resource for wave and it's not very energy intensive. Tidal, Can you hear me? I just had a message, so I'm getting network interference. No, okay. Tidal is similar story to wave. It's very localized. We do well in Northern Europe. There are bits that as part of Australia does. You can see there where it's dark red, but again, tends to be very localized. I'm getting a bit short of time, so I haven't got much time to go into the issue of resources. Yes, we're going to have to dig up a lot of stuff to do this, but what I call the specific quantities, the quantity per unit of output is reducing as things get more efficient. Many companies are moving away from extremely exotic materials, trying to, and succeeding. So, for example, lithium-ion batteries probably will become sodium in the near future. Sodium is much more widely available, of course, and there's a lot of effort going into recycling and the circular economy. I just want to finish off just a little bit on the technology of wind energy, since it's what I know most about, I guess. There's a typical modern wind turbine. In a conceptual sense, not much to it really. You've got the blades, there's generate lift, turn in the wind. They turn very slowly, so you have to have a gearbox which speeds that up to a speed which can go into a generator, and then the power is then conditioned, and it goes down the tower and out into the wider world. They've got bigger over time. Sorry, I have trouble with this. There we go. Back in 2005, a sort of 140 meter to the tip wind turbine was big. And then they grew a bit and they grew a bit. And now we're up to these monsters which are going offshore, 15 megawatts each one of capacity. That's possibly approaching towards the limit. There are certain scaling issues which work against you as you get bigger and bigger. You know, it's why an elephant doesn't look the same as a mouse. Certain scaling laws apply to elephants as much as wind turbines. So my guess would be 20 megawatts you might find is approaching the practical limit. But there's a huge amount of research going into improving them. Obviously, mechanically, people are looking at improving the aerodynamics with fancy tips and things like that. There's a lot of incremental advance still to come. That's on the aerodynamic mechanical side, but another side that's helping a great deal, which is more computing intensive, is condition monitoring. This is the little turbines that I run. We've recently had a condition monitoring system installed. It sends its data up over the cloud to a company called Onyx. They analyze all the data for us, and they just look for exceptions. So if things are going fine, they don't report. If suddenly there's a change in the vibration from a bearing, or we also monitor the oil. If you start to get particles in the oil, you can see there we've got an anomaly, the blue dots where that turbine has deviated from the previous ones. And it turns out I've had a report today to say that we've got a major problem with that gearbox. We're probably going to have it replaced. But the thing about that is it's identified it before it's broken. So the cost of the repair will probably be greatly reduced. So that's happening more and more, particularly if you go offshore. I mean, our turbines are on land. You can drive up the car. You can't do that offshore. So if you go offshore, this sort of thing becomes more and more important, and it's highly data intensive, of course. And people are using drones. We're doing that onshore as well as offshore. There's companies that have come up with some very clever software where a camera looks at the turbine, takes a photograph, feeds that to the drone, and then the drone knows where the blades are and flies the blades remotely, taking photographs with a powerful SLR. That's then uploaded to AI, which sifts through it and throws away probably 99% of the pictures because they're just boring pictures of bits of plastic. And then where there's a defect, it highlights them And still today, the human eye is still the best for picking up particularly the minor defects, though the machine learning is getting better all the time. People are looking at robots to crawl up the blades and make repairs, do inspections. There are survey vessels, remote survey vessels offshore, because again, obviously working offshore it's really expensive getting people there. You're 30, 40 miles offshore. If you're not careful, the technicians spend all their time just going back and forth. There's a lot going on today as we speak in this sort of area. There's a lot of exciting ideas for the future. Turbines are going to be on floating foundations offshore. Well, they are already. That's going to be happening more and more on the left there. Turbines floating, which enables them to go into deeper water. People are looking at using kites as a way of generating electricity. We'll look at that on the next slide. Possibly multi-rotors, because as I say, the scaling laws militate against going bigger and bigger with single turbines. So what about putting lots of littler turbines on the same foundation? That's possible. We may even move away from the propeller type wind turbine and start looking again at the vertical axis machines, which were looked at a lot in the 60s, in the 70s and 80s, and then fell out of favor. And finally, this is the the kite type thing. You have an airplane structure sitting on a foundation there. It takes off with its propellers, gets up to a height on strings, and then depending on the technology, some generate power up in the air and send it down the strings by electricity. Others do it by reeling themselves in and out, and then the power is generated by the device that reels them in and out. So you see, there's an awful lot going on. There are some underlying, conventional technologies which will take us a very long way, but there's masses of innovation happening. Obviously, there's a lot going on in solar, which I haven't covered. It's not so visually dramatic, but there's a huge amount of research going into improving the yield of solar panels, reducing the amount of materials you need so they become more efficient. And so I'm very confident that we will be able to ramp up the S-curve and come out the other end in 2040, 2050 with a fully decarbonized electricity network. So thank you for listening, and obviously very happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Colin. It's really a very, very interesting talk and really, really enlightening. And I once again would like to thank you for the presentation, for giving this amazing talk today to us. I also would like to thank Diana, who got us in touch with Colin. So thank you very much. And you all are free to drop your questions in the chat, and I'm gonna read the questions to you, Colin. We already have one from Peter. So I'm just going to read it out. Great talk, thank you. With nuclear, we couldn't see the downsides at the time, hence the prediction that electricity would be free. Can you see any possible downsides of renewables? Example, lack of limited resources, hard to recycle waste. Interested in hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's the bit that probably worries me most is, these things are unavoidably relatively low energy intensity. Therefore, you need a lot of stuff to do the energy conversion. So where's the resources going to come from, and what do we do at the end? That is something that we have to take very, very seriously. If we're trying to make a better world, we don't want to fill it up with dead wind turbines and old bits of solar panel. Or indeed batteries. Batteries are something that where it seems to worry people a lot. Interestingly, if you take electric vehicles, the battery can be taken out of the cars. Once it gets to about 80% of its capacity, it tends to be regarded as no longer suitable for use in the car because the car wants a range. But that battery, it ages slowly, and you can then take it out of the car and put it into a fixed energy storage system like you see in the bottom left picture there, and where it'll last many, many years more. Lithium ion and those sort of batteries don't seem to suddenly die like lead acid, like we used to in our cars. So they just slowly grow old. And of course, the energy density doesn't matter so much on land. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff being thought about. People are looking at ways of recycling carbon fiber in the blades, because the blades these days have got more and more carbon fiber in them. The towers, of course, of wind turbines are steel, so we know as a civilization how to recycle steel. That's not difficult, but it's the fiberglass that's the problem. It's not been solved yet. I think it will be, but it certainly hasn't been solved yet. Fortunately, not many wind turbines are reaching the end of their life. A lot, like ours that I operate, were actually extending their life. They were originally designed for 20 years. We think they will last for 35, maybe 40 years. So it's going to be a good while till our turbines become scrap. For solar, yeah, it's again, you're using some fairly exotic materials. People are trying to move away from that and making some progress there. And obviously, actually recycling the panels at the end of their life. But again, they don't suddenly die. They just gradually, about 0.25% a year, lose their conversion efficiency. So they actually will last a very long time before we need to recycle them. And given we need all the energy we can get for the time being, I don't think recycling of solar panels is going to be an issue for many years to come. But yeah, it is a real challenge.
Awesome, thank you very much, Colin. So Peter just answered saying, interesting answer, thank you. So perhaps we are more aware of recycling than we were in the 50s, which is good.
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, a lot of the people who are in this industry are concerned for the wider environment, if you like. We do what we do because we want to make the place better and run a business. I mean, I'm not pretending everyone's altruistic, but generally the people I know in the industry want to make the world a better place, so they don't want to cover it with waste unnecessarily.
Thank you, Colin. We have another question from Daniel. So Daniel is asking, sorry, if wind speed and hence turbine blade speed keeps varying, how can you produce a stable 50 hertz output?
Good question. I don't know. I don't know how it's done. It is done, and that much I know. I'm sorry, I'm not an electrical engineer. I can't answer that in any convincing way, except to say that it does happen. I mean, our turbines are connected to the grid, and the power is conditioned in a way that the grid finds acceptable.
That's great. We also have another question from Diana. Thanks for an excellent talk. You mentioned tidal energy. Why is this not used more as it's so reliable?
Well, it's interesting that you say it's reliable. Yes, it is reliable in the sense that you can predict when the tides are coming and going, of course, but they won't necessarily come and go when you want the power. So its predictability isn't as valuable as people imagine. And of course, as you may well know, you get spring and neap tides, and the difference in power output between spring tides and neap tides can be a factor of 2 or more, depending on the site. So there is considerable variability in tidal energy. I mean, it's not to discount it, but its predictability isn't as valuable as people imagine. Up until now, tidal has remained intractably expensive. It's still back, way up the cost curve, and this is a very much a personal view, but I think it may never come down the cost curve for two reasons. One is history tells us that once certain technologies get ahead, it's very, very hard for others to catch up because all the resources, all the money, everything backs certain horses, and the other horses tend to get ignored, even if they are potentially good. So that may well happen. But there's a technical issue that with wind energy, particularly offshore, the turbines have got bigger and bigger. And the cost of the foundation for a big turbine is not that different to the cost for a little turbine. So that has had a huge impact on the economics. If you like, the fixed cost, the foundation costs, the cable costs, and everything have more capacity attached to them. That's more difficult with tidal and indeed with wind, wave energy. The machines tend to be limited in size, partly water depth in the case of tidal and wavelength in the case of wave. So you end up having to have, relatively speaking, lots and lots of rather smaller machines, and they've got to be attached to the seabed, which is an expensive thing to do. So it may well be that they never actually get the same efficiency from their attachment to the seabed that wind turbines do. But I may be proved wrong. Who knows? We'll see. Certainly, Northern Europe has a good tidal resource, so there's a substantial amount of good tidal energy not far from demand. And there's bits in Canada, but there aren't many other places in the world where there's a lot of resource close to demand. So that again may limit the market and stop, it means when you're trying to come down this cost curve, there's less demand for the product, so you come down more slowly.
That's great. Thank you very much, Colin. That's great. I actually have a question in terms of so we hear a lot about the UK being one of the leading countries in green energy and a major player in that. What are your thoughts on that? How do you see the UK in the global scenario for green energy, and how do you see the UK in the future as well in terms of leading green energy and research and so on?
Yeah, I mean, as you saw in that that graph with all the squares on, the UK has done pretty well. We're second behind Germany in terms of the amount of electricity we get from renewables, and we've done that mainly on the back of onshore wind energy and some solar and increasingly offshore wind. I think I see the UK internationally having a lead in offshore wind. We are globally seen as the leader in that, both in terms of actually our installed capacity and our manufacturing and other capability. I mean, the companies building the turbines are not actually British. Siemens, Gamesa, and Vestas are the main ones in the UK, but they've set up massive UK manufacturing, and an awful lot of this innovation, the smaller scale stuff, if you like, the drones, the all that sort of thing, is very much UK based companies servicing this massively growing industry. So I think that's where we will keep our lead. We don't have a strong role in solar. Solar is a commodity industry. It's a bulk commodity industry. You need huge factories turning out solar panels in lower labor cost countries. So somewhere like China is probably going to retain the lead there. We are encouraging investment in gigafactories to build batteries for cars. I don't know whether that would constitute us being a leader, but we're up there with it. But it tends to be people coming into the UK to invest in those, bringing their technology with them. So in terms of where people look to us, particularly, I think it's offshore wind.
Thank you very much, Colin. I have another question from Daniel. So where does hydroelectricity fit in? Thinking particularly of countries like Iceland, Norway, etc. Possibly Scotland too.
Yeah, I mean, hydro is a renewable source, and it's one we've had for for donkey's years. So to that extent, it's an important source in its own right. But it also has increasingly a role in this grid balancing and everything. So instead of just thinking of having a reservoir up high, waiting for the rain to fill it up, and then the water comes down the hill, you can think in terms also of pumping it back up the hill when there's an excess of renewable energy. You imagine a day when there's very strong winds, maybe also the sun is shining. Not, I mean, it doesn't happen very often, but you sometimes get that. What do you do with all that power? You don't really want to dump it if you can avoid it. If you can pump the water back uphill, then it's a way of storing energy, and that's what De Norwig does. In fact, it's a hydro system, but it's pumped up and down. So yeah, hydro has that role. And another thing people are doing is they're covering the hydro lakes with solar, and it reduces the evaporation. And of course, you've already got a connection. So it comes back to this business of combining the two. You combine the solar with the hydro. You can imagine letting the hydro up and down and ending up with an almost constant or demand following source of energy when you combine those two together.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Colin. I cannot see any new questions. If anyone has any other questions I would like to post in the chat, I've got, I think, another one. So another one from Peter. Are we all going to need our own battery? Do you see national grid batteries or both?
Probably, well, both. I mean, there are people, again, in that picture bottom left, people are installing large banks of battery storage. Whether we will all end up with batteries in separate batteries in our home, I'm actually skeptical. I think as we get more and more EVs, we will use the batteries in our cars in our homes. I mean, for example, I'm sitting here now, I have an old EV outside. It's completely dumb, unfortunately, but it's got 20 kilowatt hours of power in it at the moment. I could be running my computer and the lights in the house off that now, having charged it during the day we had a lovely sunny day. So I don't know whether people will install that many domestic batteries if this vehicle to home technology becomes more widespread, which I suspect it will. And also, that then the cars get all connected up and you actually get paid for providing what are called grid services. When the grid is struggling, it draws down or absorbs power into a whole lot of cars. So yeah, I think the cars will become our individual batteries, coupled with large-scale deployment on the network, and also the longer-term storage like hydrogen and ammonia.
Awesome, Colin. Thank you very much. Again, so far, I don't think we have new questions. So I would like to again, Colin, thank you for this amazing, very, very interesting talk. Thank Diana as well that's listening for providing and linking Colin with the brunch. So thank you very much. It was a very good talk, really, really engaging. We had a lot of people watching it. It's recorded and it's available in our BCS website. I just would like to mention that our next webinar is also in our the link for the next webinar, which will be in April, is in our website as well. It's going to be the next webinar will be on the science of spearfishing and it's a talk from Armor Blocks, and the speaker is Lauren Cash, and it's going to be also very, very interesting. Colin, once again, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to have you.
May I just say one final thing? It's topical. All this. I mean, we are facing very high electricity bills at the moment. Renewables are the way of stopping that, because renewables don't have a resource, an input cost. So they just run. I mean, you'll find almost all the wind farms running and solar farms running in the country at the moment are charging exactly the same for the electricity they export than they did before this crisis started. So they're actually responsible for putting a limit on the upper price limit. And many of them are actually paying money back to the government, to the country, under the contract structures they've got. So if we didn't have renewables, our prices would be even higher than they are.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Colin. And I think this is one of the main reasons, alongside your amazing talk, this is another great reason why green energy is, a very interesting talk and so good for us to hear about that.
Right.
Awesome, Colin. I don't know, Colin, if you want to have your contact details, maybe if anyone wants to maybe contact you later, if you want.
How, I mean, what do you want, my email address?
Probably if anyone wants to talk to you after the talk and maybe get in touch with you, I'm happy to post in the chat if that's okay with you. Otherwise,
yeah, well, I can post it in the chat. I expect I'm not beyond bit of, yeah.
I think so. Just in case if anyone wants to follow up with you on that.
Yeah.
Yes.
ColinPalmer@me.com.